Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer. And this is another episode in our series entitled A Fresh Look at Fair Housing. And in this episode, we want to address bias, specifically if a seller or landlord is indicating bias and you're trying to figure out as their broker what to do in that scenario. So let me introduce our subject matter experts who, once again, I'm so grateful to have with me.
My name is Adria Buchanan. I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Washington.
I'm Deborah Blom, and I'm a realtor in Clark County.
Thanks to both of you for being here. So again, bias. Deborah, have you ever dealt with a seller who evidences clear bias that you believe violates the or would violate the Fair Housing Act?
Yeah, absolutely. Several years ago, I had sellers that did not want to sell to a couple that was unmarried. And they, thankfully, we ended up getting another offer that was higher, and we had a justifiable business reason for accepting the other offer, because otherwise I was going to have to inform them that I could not allow them to commit a fair housing violation.
Okay, so they just flat out would not sell to buyers,
would not sell to an unmarried couple.
Have you ever seen anything like that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we do see it. What happens too sometimes is that maybe the seller doesn't come right out and say what their biases are, but they express them in other ways, and so talking about, they might be showing the house and they hear things from their neighbors about people that have come in to see the home. And based on the profile and what they hear from the neighbors, they may relay something to their agent around, oh, well, by the way, I would prefer XYZ, or, I don't want this. I think that this person wouldn't be a good fit for this community, right? And so you hear other types of language that indicate what their preferences are. And so again, really, I think as the agent, you're interested in getting them the best financial outcome from the transaction, right? And so informing them that, hey, even though you've expressed this bias, it really might not be in your best financial interest in the end. Like, let's see what all the offers are and then make a decision based on that, and not what you think the new look of the community should be.
I'm going to go off on a little tangent here because you just made me think of something. So bringing you two together, part of what your organization does is trying to help a buyer who believes, or a tenant who believes they've been impacted unfairly by a violation of the Fair Housing Act.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what you do is to try and bring them together with the person who they believe has violated the Fair Housing Act to try and reach resolution. So it would even be at some level, maybe counseling with that seller. Would there be an occasion where it would, let's say Deborah was working with that seller who says, this is my only buyer, or this is the best buyer, this is the buyer with the highest price and terms, you should be accepting this offer, and they say, will not do it. Would that be an occasion for Deborah to reach out to you, or Deborah to advise the seller to call you, or how does your organization play into that?
Sure. So in that particular situation, either Deborah or the seller could contact us and say, hey, I'm having this issue, or this is a situation. Also, we might hear from the buyer, and right. or their agent, and they could contact us and say, hey, we've just seen this house, or we think that have a really strong offer, and we don't understand why our offer wasn't accepted. And so then that's a conversation. So in some ways we could act as a mediator. Other times it might be that one party or the other chooses to file a complaint, and then we take it through the complaint process.
Okay.
And so then more evidence would be gathered, and a third party would determine what the resolution would be, and if there was in fact enough evidence to suggest that there was some difference in treatment.
Sellers express bias in all variety of ways. I mean, a lot of times when I'm teaching a fair housing class, there's the folks who are in attendance who say, I'm here because I have to be here. I've got a requirement under Washington law that I take a fair housing class, but honestly, I don't think fair housing really exists, or I think fair housing issues exist any longer. This is kind of from yesterday brought forward to today, and now I have to take a class about it. And that might be true for a lot of sellers and a lot of brokers who don't see themselves as ever engaging in racial discrimination or discrimination against somebody based on their sexual orientation. But I think that there are sometimes even more subtle acts of discrimination, like you referenced,
Yeah, there's a lot of coded language that we hear people use. And so, again, that's why documentation is important. And for clients who think that they've experienced some level of discrimination, it's important to really think about, well, what was it that you heard, or what was it that you experienced? And, for agents to also share with their clients, share with the sellers, really be mindful of your language and how you're talking about potential buyers and how you're talking about what the amenities are, because, there are lots of situations where maybe, like Deborah, her client, maybe for whatever reason, she is not the one that's present when another buyer is walking through the property, right? There's another agent that's there. And so if that person is not aware in the same way of what the fair housing violations could be, they could be talking to that client in a way that is, bringing up those biases.
Right.
And so, it's a tricky situation to navigate, but as long as everybody understands what their rights and responsibilities are, then those conversations can go a lot better.
It also makes me think back to another episode that we've already covered in this series, Deborah, where you brought up the presentation of offers, multiple offers through a chart versus putting an offer in front of somebody. Do you do that if there's only one offer or only if there's multiple offers?
I typically do it with multiple offers. Because if there's only one offer, they're going to sign when they're going to see everything on there anyways, if we only have one offer. So I typically do it with multiple offers. But the other piece of doing that is to prove presentation. I do have all of my offers, respectfully declined, so that if there's any question about whether or not an offer was presented, it absolutely was presented. Here's how I presented it first. And I make sure there's an electronic copy of that spreadsheet to my sellers so that I can prove I showed them just the terms of your offer, and then here was your offer actually being delivered with respectfully declined. Okay. So just making sure that that is fair for everyone across the board. That's always the process.
Yeah. And I think
process,
process keyword. And I think the other part of that, that Deborah mentioned in a previous video in this series was not having the buyer's name specifically, right? Because we know, again, there are a lot of proxies for race and ethnicity. And so the more that you can make that process as neutral as possible and really just present the terms to the seller, the less likely you are to run into situations where people are exhibiting bias, right? Because bias, it can be unconscious, right? And so even just presenting names, they might not have any reason to really want to treat people differently, but just because of the way that we've been conditioned, right, those things come up. So however you can be as neutral in your process as possible, do that.
It can be unconscious, true. It can also be stealth. The seller might fully intend to discriminate, but a savvy broker is going to have their antenna up. I think sometimes about questions that I get about video doorbells,
absolutely,
where seller's not in the home, and a neighbor doesn't report who was there, but the seller goes back and watches their camera and says, this was a Black couple, this was a homosexual couple, this was a family with a child who was loud, and in their own minds, and they don't say anything to their broker. But in my mind, I'm not selling to whoever this buyer might have been. Something that I've only seen in the last couple of years is I get questions from brokers asking, my buyer will not buy in a neighborhood where people voted a specific way in the last election, or my seller wants to know how these buyers voted in the last election. So, maybe you're wearing something that indicates how you lean politically. And the seller sees that. Well, that's not a good example because political ideology is protected in some local jurisdictions, but not at a state level. So let's go back to our state or federal protected classes. Seller sees something on the video doorbell that makes them say, I'm not selling to that buyer. And now you get you make your presentation, and there's one offer that stands out, $20,000 more than anybody else. and the seller is hesitant to accept it, and you're trying to figure out why, and they're saying, oh, well, the closing date's important to me. Well, the closing dates aren't that different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, contingencies are important. Well, the contingencies aren't that different. And broker, you're going to have to put on your, X-ray vision glasses and see through whatever that screen is from the seller.
Yeah, I think you usually get a heads up to know that something like that is coming if they ask you questions about who was viewing the home this afternoon.
Oh,
You'll get follow-up questions of, oh, do you know anything about the buyers from this afternoon? Or, oh, do you know anything about that agent? But some sort of a follow-up question if they haven't been asking those follow-up questions all along. So then again, going back to processes, I just always, as a habit, after every showing, I follow up with the agent to ask how did the showing go and report it back to the seller in a timely and regular manner. So there's a process of, I'm not saying anything different about your clients than I would be about anybody else's clients when I'm reporting back to the sellers. And again, electronic copy of all of it.
if only every broker would do it. But they're learning. So I think the best way to conclude this conversation, if there's nothing else from either of you at the moment, is to remind brokers that you have liability in a transaction if your seller or your landlord is biased and violates the Fair Housing Act. People have their own intrinsic thoughts, and they're allowed to have those as long as they don't play out in the form of a Fair Housing Act violation. And so brokers I don't think most of you are ever going to encounter a scenario where you have a seller who says, I'm flat out not selling to this buyer no matter what. But you have to be prepared to encounter that seller. And if you do, if you help them with counseling and you even bring your best counseling to the table and help them understand why they cannot refuse to sell to this buyer for whatever the reason is that they want to refuse to sell to this buyer, then listing broker, you have to know what your next steps are. And here are your next steps. Your next steps are to say, seller, you're violating the Fair Housing Act. You are telling me that you have an intention to violate the Fair Housing Act, and I will not participate. We're done. If you don't change your approach, we're done. I'm not changing my approach. Then we're done. And the fact that you have a listing agreement, which is a mutually binding agreement, you don't have the unilateral right, brokers, to terminate that listing agreement. But when the seller violates the Fair Housing Act, that's a breach of that listing agreement. It's a violation of state and federal law, and you are not required. In fact, you should not continue in your representation of that seller. And you should instead make very clear that you are severing your relationship with this seller. And when an action, whether it's a complaint or a lawsuit, is brought against this seller, you will testify as to what happened, even though that means they will likely be found liable for a violation of the Fair Housing Act. And in fact, brokers, you are a beneficiary under the Fair Housing Act to the extent that if you are denied compensation that you've earned by bringing a ready, willing, and able buyer to the seller, and the seller refuses to sell, you've earned your compensation by bringing that ready, willing, and able buyer, but you're denied compensation by the seller's violation of the Fair Housing Act, you're entitled under the Fair Housing Act to potentially at least collect that compensation. So, seller, not only will I be testifying against you, but I'll also be potentially making a claim for compensation. And then brokers, you go back to your office and you immediately report to your designated broker what just happened. And you document your transaction folder with everything that the seller or the landlord said and did, everything that you said in response, including your admonition, your counseling and your admonition, and your termination of the relationship. And you keep that for the time when you need it, because chances are good you'll need it.
I would say, and after you have all that stuff, if you decide you want to file a complaint, that's something that you can do with our agency too.
Your agency again is what? Who?
Fair Housing Center of Washington.
And Fair Housing Center of Washington covers primarily counties in Western Washington?
Correct.
And some Central Washington?
Yes. So we're in 23 counties in Western and Central Washington, and the Northwest Fair Housing Alliance, located in Spokane, they cover the other remaining counties.
Northwest Fair Housing Alliance. Okay, great. Thank you. If you have questions on this topic, you might address them to her agency. Or you can always ask questions of me at the Legal Hotline by visiting WARealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.